In addition to the president's comments on Iran, he also made strong predictions about the future of Cuba. Joining us to discuss this is John Suarez, Executive Director, Center for a Free Cuba. So, John, good afternoon to you. First of all, I have a clip here of President Trump talking about this subject. I just want you to take a quick listen.
And Cuba will be failing pretty soon. Cuba is really a nation that's very close to failing. You know, they got their money from Venezuela. They got the oil from Venezuela. They're not getting that anymore.
I mean, what do you make of Trump's comments here? Do you expect to see something like this happening soon?
Well, I think when we talk about Cuba failing, the regime in Havana, that means when they're no longer able to repress. The Cuban military has a cash reserve of $18 billion, and they have prioritized repression over every other opportunity to provide services to the Cuban people. There's no food, the infrastructure is collapsing, water can't be delivered to homes, but they have an effective secret police state operating in the island. And they also have a military that's exporting mercenaries to fight in Ukraine. There are about 30,000 Cubans in Venezuela, which I believe one of the demands being made by the Trump administration to Delcy Rodriguez is for those Cubans to return home to Havana. Now, if the cutback in oil and also the cutback in drug trafficking, the presence of that armada of the United States and the Caribbean is also cut back in the trafficking of drugs, which has been another source of income for the regime, which Secretary Rubio, in his written remarks delivered today to the United States Senate, highlighted. With those two elements of resources taken away, I do believe that the situation for the dictatorship is growing existential, and the Trump administration has indicated that they're willing to negotiate. We don't know exactly what the terms are in that negotiation, but I think knowing Secretary Rubio and his commitment to a democratic transition and the commitment of the Trump administration, their national security document, that hostile regimes like the one in Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, backed by Russia, Venezuela, and Iran, will no longer be tolerated. I think we are going to see regime change.
Okay, so you brought up Secretary of State Marco Rubio's testimony today. I have a clip about that, so let's just listen to that as well.
Will you make a public commitment today to rule out U.S. regime change in Cuba?
Regime change?
Yes.
Oh, no, I think we would love to see the regime there change. We would like to. That doesn't mean that we're going to make a change, but we would love to see it change. There's no doubt about the fact that it would be of great benefit to the United States if Cuba was no longer governed by an autocratic regime.
Can you talk to us some more about what are the circumstances? How else might the Cuban regime fall?
Well, I think it's important to highlight in his testimony, he mentioned that codified into U.S. law with the Helms-Burton law, Cuban Democracy Act, passed in February of 1996 following the February 24th, 1996 Brothers to the Rescue shootdown. This is where Cuban MiGs in international airspace shot down 2 U.S. registered planes, killing 3 U.S. citizens and a U.S. resident in an act of state terrorism. And at the time, the Clinton administration, which had been trying to improve relations, had 3 options: do nothing, a military intervention, or toughen sanctions. And they went with toughening sanctions by codifying. And in that codification, it says that if you want to lift sanctions on Cuba, there have to be certain things done: multi-party elections, legalizing multi-parties, freeing all political prisoners, and a number of other basic things that would usher in a democratic transition. That is U.S. law. That is not something up to the president or Secretary of State Rubio to decide on. Even Barack Obama, during his thaw, he could not completely lift U.S. sanctions. He could make it more flexible, he could improve things, but it would require the U.S. Congress to actually change the law to be able to remove sanctions, which is one of the elements that is making life difficult for the dictatorship today.
All right, John, I have one more clip here of comedian Bill Maher, who hit on this issue as well. And this clip has been making the rounds. So I think it's worth it to just take a quick look.
If he somehow gets Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran all to be not these horrible places they were, he should get a Nobel Peace Prize.
You know, John, I think we can all agree that this issue is beyond politics. What needs to happen to bring more unity on this issue?
Well, I don't know if you'll get the Nobel Peace Prize, but I do know that if those three regimes undergo a transition away from the current hostile anti-American dictatorships, in the case of Iran, it's in the midst of a genocide against the Iranian people, which, by the way, Cuba is an ally of the Iranian regime and has been supporting them diplomatically. There were votes at the UN condemning the killing. I think there's some estimates saying 30,000 Iranians killed in these protests over the last few weeks. Cuba is one of the small group of countries that back the mullahs in Iran and not the people out in the streets. And lastly, the left talks a lot about imperialism, but they don't mention that the Cuban dictatorship, which has made a leitmotif of anti-imperialism, is currently sent 25,000 Cuban troops to Russia, 6,000 to 7,000 presently in the field, fighting for Mr. Ukraine and his imperial war, for Mr. Putin against his imperial war. They've sent 25,000 troops to fight in Ukraine for Mr. Putin and his imperial war to eliminate the self-determination of an entire people. And then at the same time, they complain about U.S. imperialism. They're hypocrites.
John, for a moment, can we take an educated guess here? Give us your analysis on what reaction would we see inside Cuba if the U.S. did take some form of action?
Well, you have the military elite and the communist hardliners that would be hostile. You have approximately 6.5 million other Cubans to 7 million Cubans that would be ecstatic to see change. They've taken to the streets. The response of the regime in 2021 and 2023 has been to violently repress. Their video that came out in July of 2021 showing the Cuban military using live ammunition against unarmed protesters. So it's an unpopular regime that maintains power through terror. An intervention by the United States would most likely be greeted by the vast majority of the Cubans in a favorable light.
Okay, what about outside of Cuba? What does it mean more broadly for the world and people worldwide if this communist regime falls?
Well, Cuba is a symbol for international communism. They have been bringing in hundreds of thousands of young people to promote the communist ideology. They're viewed, and I think if we go back to 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed, Fidel Castro, together with Lula da Silva, created the Sao Paulo Forum, and the idea was to regain what was lost. He then also developed close ties with Communist China, which had begun already in the aftermath of the Tiananmen Square massacre, which Havana supported. It's one of the few countries that actually came out and said they supported the massacre of students in Tiananmen. So that relationship, it'll definitely be very hot in terms of communist propaganda networks, and there'll be great hostility to the downfall of this communist regime that's been in power for 67 years.
Okay, John, that's all the time we have today. Really appreciate you coming on. Thank you.
Thank you.